Dallas Cowboys are up first. We've got a season where everybody's upset. You know, they only lost in the divisional round here. And Mike McCarthy says he's calling plays. Brian Schottenheimer's coming in to be the offensive coordinator in title. And it's time to talk what the Cowboys need. And it might be the same need that they had last year. It didn't seem like their wide receiver core was terrible, but losing Amari Cooper, it pushed everybody up a peg. So you put wide receiver 2 in particular as the top need for the Cowboys.
It pushed everybody up a peg, and Michael Gallup was coming back off that significant injury and wasn't the same guy, at least in year one. Now, maybe if Gallup comes back year 2 and looks like, himself again, then this, I think, it doesn't evaporate, but it becomes an awful lot less significant. Like, they can get by a lot more with that scenario. But if Gallup is just sort of not the same guy again, they missed Amari Cooper hugely. Like, there was a reason that we were being inundated with OBJ to Dallas rumors for the last month and a half of the season or whatever it was. They needed that kind of influx. And T.Y. Hilton sort of added a little bit of a spark late on, but it just wasn't enough. Like, they need another guy that can come in and take some of the pressure away from CeeDee Lamb.
So when we look at the needs, and if you guys have listened to our shows in the past, we talk a lot about the pass game and, receivers and corners as needs, even when it doesn't seem like it on paper. We don't completely neglect running backs, but clearly those are lesser needs, we would say. I think whether or not Michael Gallup is healthy, though, this is a place they need to attack. Now, how you attack it is less clear than in past years. I think the free agent class is extremely weak at most positions, but at receiver, we're talking about Jacoby Myers as the top option right now, coming out of the New England Patriots. Juju Smith-Schuster as the second receiver on our board here, Odell Beckham Jr. Now, if he comes back and he's healthy, I could understand him, maybe being the top receiver available, but there's a big question mark there with injury. So filling, one of my themes this offseason is going to be teams getting creative, right? It's not as simple as go to the free agent market. I think the draft is kind of all over the place when it comes to receivers in particular. Is there some creativity that Dallas can tap into here to try to get that next player in here?
Yeah, it's one of the worst free agent groups I can remember for a long, long time. And I don't know if that's just, a trend of the NFL, that this is going to be weak free agent groups, teams are getting better with dealing with that, blah, 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 or if this is just a bad year. But maybe you're going to see, like last year, where all the movement was trading. We were trading for receivers rather than signing them in free agency. Maybe we see a repeat of that. Maybe that's the way the league is going to go, that teams are going to start focusing more on trades than they are in real letting free agents hit the open market.
I think the offensive line came together all right for Dallas. We look at Dalton Schultz as a free agent here, and so they have to figure something out at tight end. Defensively, a few starters are going to hit the market. Leighton Vander Esch, Anthony Brown at corner. Vander Esch, of course, is a linebacker. They could always use some depth along the defensive line, but I agree with what you're saying. The biggest need for the Dallas Cowboys being the number 2 wide receiver spot opposite CeeDee Lamb.
Yeah, it's another situation, a lot like last year, where Dallas is running into free agency, and when you look at the list of guys they have from their own team that are scheduled to leave, it's quite extensive, and they're quite important players in various spots. So
Tony Pollard, one of them as well. They have to. Running back's going to be a need, right? We saw Zeke.
Well, certainly,
Zeke
if Pollard
could barely average
there,
2 yards per catch. Right. It's a need.
It's not a need as long as Pollard is there, and you're like, well, look, just stop giving Zeke Elliott the carries and give it to Tony Pollard instead. But if Pollard leaves, or again, if he's not 100% coming off an injury, then it's back to just Zeke trudging along trying to get any kind of production. But my point being, for the second year in a row, it's like Dallas have been surprised by free agency, by their own players' contracts coming due. Like last year, the Amari Cooper thing felt like a shock. It's like, oh, we're not prepared for Amari Cooper to be earning $20 million a year. We've got to get rid of him. Whereas now it's like we're not prepared for 3 or 4 key players to be hitting free agency. We actually need most of those guys. So they're going to have the work cut out again to try and bring them back.
All right, let's go on to the New York Giants, staying in the NFC East here. The Giants, you put in the article, interior offensive line as their biggest need. It's an interesting situation in New York, a team that made the playoffs, They win a playoff game, but they were still kind of rebuilding though, right? Like it was year one of what was supposed to be a rebuild. So you went with interior of the offensive line for the Giants.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of places you could add talent and be fine. But that offensive line was an absolute mess pretty much all season long. Andrew Thomas is great at left tackle. Evan Neal was a top draft pick, first round pick a year ago. Evan Neal really struggled last season, but so did Andrew Thomas year one. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's how it works for every offensive tackle, that year one, they're terrible. Year two, they're a bit better. Year three, they're great. So, there's a pathway for Evan Neal to get better. We saw it on the other side of the line. Andrew Thomas did it year after year. Or Evan Neal might just be bad. But either way, he's going to get another year to figure it out, whereas the interior trio was just a weakness all the way through the season.
Sometimes there's a disconnect, right? Because the on-field product for the Giants was solid offensively. I think a big part of that was Daniel Jones as a runner. We talk about the hidden yards and various things like that a running quarterback is able to essentially account for. Daniel Jones was one of those guys, like a top 3 or 4 impactful runner at the quarterback position. And I think it did mask, that stat that the graphic that we had up with 114 pressures allowed along the interior of the offensive line. And you have games where Saquon Barkley had some big runs at the end and all that stuff. So when you're watching the Giants, it doesn't feel like the offensive line is an issue all the time, but it kind of was, right? There was pressure, and they're not the best run blocking unit. And even though I think Evan Neal's going to be fine, I like their tackles, both with Nick Gates hitting free agency and just uncertainty elsewhere. It does make a lot of sense here.
And the line got worse when they had to go into the bench. Like,
right.
The starting trio wasn't good, but then the backups were terrible. So you could argue the line isn't as bad as it looked all the way through the year, but it's still pretty bad.
Of course, my answer would be receiver. And the Giants didn't make a ton of sense, right? Because every place where they had invested in receiver, they were getting nothing in return. First rounder for Kadarius Toney, they flipped him off to Kansas City. Flipped him off? Sent him off to Kansas. Look, sometimes you're rusty coming out of vacation. I'm exhausted coming back from Disney vacation, by the way.
Disney's not a holiday.
Not for, obviously for the kids. And we were like, the kids too, were like, sorry kids, you're up till 1. We got to get up at 6. We got to get to the park. You don't get to sleep here. So cry it out. We're going to have some fun.
So have fun whether you like it or not.
So bear with me here. Can't wait for the Super Bowl week where I could, sleep in.
Right.
And, but I would have said receiver, right? Even though they invested in Kadarius Toney and invested in Kenny Golladay and still had a lot of success with guys like Isaiah Hodgins stepping up and Richie James stepping up and Darius Slayton. Well, James and Slayton are both free agents. And, I would have said receiver, much like Dallas, just overall. But I like interior offensive line, receiver. I'm very fascinated to see what Brian Daboll does in year 2. You could also say quarterback since they don't, have one under contract that's a starter.
But I think you have to assume that they're bringing back Daniel Jones in some capacity. They can definitely use receiver help, obviously, but I think they patched it up well enough last season that you can kind of say, all right, even if they don't do anything other than keep what they have, maybe draft a receiver, even not in the first round, they're probably okay. Like Wan'Dale Robinson, the draft pick from a year ago, and he played in like 6 games or whatever. So I can see a world where that receiver group is fine, even if they don't do anything crazy to address it, whereas the offensive line is a catastrophe if they don't.
The PFF NFL podcast is sponsored by Western and Southern Financial Group. While you focus on your roster moves, Western and Southern helps advance your money moves. Buying your first home, planning to start a family, wondering how to make your money grow? Well, Western and Southern's playbook of life insurance, investment, and retirement solutions helps you rest assured on game day. Team up to understand needs and address goals with a game plan built just for you. Get started at westernsouthern.com/PFF. All right, so you did one for the Philadelphia Eagles. They're playing in the Super Bowl, of course, this week. But they're next up here as far as offseason team needs. And you went with cornerback depth for the Eagles. And since I do repeat myself over and over and over again, I love the fact that the Eagles, their biggest weakness or their biggest holes are some of the players that they got on the cheap. Guys like James Bradberry. Can the Eagles get creative again, at places like cornerback this offseason?
Yeah, it's really just reloading again. Like, they signed James Bradberry for pennies on the dollar. He's been one of the better corners in the league this year in a really good defense. Presumably, he's going to be wanting a big-time contract off the back of that. I would also imagine they're not too confused with the idea of giving him one. So maybe they pay it and they say, he was worth it. It's a reward. If they win the Super Bowl, sometimes you're a little bit inclined to give out those kinds of contracts, but maybe they do that. But if they don't, there's just as good a chance that they'll pick up a James Bradbury again this year, like a cap casualty, a guy that ends up getting cut because the team doesn't want to pay him $9 million or whatever, and then the Eagles can pounce, get him again for pennies on the dollar. So really they just need to find a way of kind of reloading at those positions that were short-term moves for them a year ago and, the now are coming up, are expiring.
Yeah, we see a guy like James Bradbury, and, part of the what made that move so good was a guy like Bradbury was coming off of a down year after previous really good seasons, right? So you get him when the cost is low. The Giants did have to make him a cap casualty. They did all of this after the draft, so they didn't have to lose a comp pick, right? So they just get the year of service time pretty much on the cheap for Bradbury. And now he's probably going to walk in free agency and maybe bring that comp pick back to the Eagles. It is just a really good way of doing business. But it still leaves a hole on the depth chart going into next year, just like there was a hole on the depth chart last year at this time for the Eagles. So I am fascinated to see if they keep that same patient approach. And it's not always going to be, the same thing every year. Like, let's find the next cornerback that's, a buy low candidate and we'll sign him after he gets cut after the draft. You can't always repeat the same strategy, but, the Eagles have some work to do with Bradbury. Chauncey Gardner-Johnson was more of a safety for them, but he's a guy that, is flexible and can move around. He's going to be hitting free agency again as well. So when you do look at this Eagles team, there's a lot of free agents on the defensive side of the ball in general. Much of the offense is coming back, but it's going to, no matter what happens this Sunday in the Super Bowl with the Eagles, fascinating offseason as they have to probably make their Jalen Hurts decision as far as, when they want to pay him and how they want to distribute that money. And then how do they reload on the defensive side of the ball? We know that they always like to build in the trenches first. They have a whole bunch of, Javon Hargrave's one of our top free agents as well at defensive tackle. So they've got several starters that they need to lock up. But we also know that the Eagles have been really good when their secondary is really good. So that depth at cornerback, I think, makes sense as their biggest need.
And they're in that great spot of having 2 first-round picks.
Yeah, right. I mean, a team that, look, they've made all the right moves, man. And it felt like coming after they had their 2017 Super Bowl and they tried to run it back a couple times. They had to move on from Carson Wentz. It felt like they were supposed to be reloading, and they just accelerated it in 2021 and accelerated it even further in 2022. So Darius Slay still locked in over $16 million. He's got one more year in his contract heading into 23. That's the other thing to keep an eye on too, right? Not just cornerback depth to replace James Bradbury, but even beyond that, if Darius Slay has to walk at the end of 2023 as well. So cornerback depth for the Eagles. Don't forget, by the way, this offseason, we're going to have Fixing Your Team in 5 minutes, right, which is really 15 minutes. We'll get in depth on every single team this offseason. Let's go to the Washington Commanders to round out the NFC East. Their biggest need, Sam, QB.
Yeah. I'm not buying this idea that Sam Howell is the unquestioned starter after 7 minutes of football at the end of last season. No matter what they're telling offensive coordinator candidates, I'm just not buying it. I refuse to believe that a team would still act that way in 2023. So they need a quarterback.
I'm always the guy that's like, let's look deeper into the quote and stuff like that, and the Ron Rivera stuff that you were pushing back on all year. He's making his decisions off vibes, right, off of Taylor Honey, and I'm like, no, it can't just be that. There's something to it, right? And I'm trying to look into this, right? Yeah. Teams say this all the time. Like, Sam Howell is the only quarterback under contract, so they're like, of course he's our starter, right? But I don't see that as them declaring their offseason strategy. I don't think. Am I looking too much into that? Their offseason strategy isn't like, we're good. Not even going to evaluate this quarterback class because we have Sam Howell as our starter. Of course, Carson Wentz is also still under contract after making $32 million a year with 2 more years left on his contract. But I think there's more to the Commanders just saying, yeah, it's Sam Howell. I think they're going to also explore other options.
Yeah, well, they should. But the reports were that they were informing offensive coordinator candidates that Sam Howell is the starter next year.
As of now.
Yeah, but as of now, they would still need to jump him over Carson Wentz, and then you've still got the draft and free agency to come. Anyway, my point being, I don't think you can go into a season with Sam Howell as the unquestioned starter and nobody else that could challenge that on the depth chart.
Yeah, so we know there's a couple names that are supposed free agents. I say supposed free agents at quarterback because Lamar Jackson, technically, Geno Smith, technically.
Yeah, and or cut candidates, trade candidates, all kinds of quarterback movement.
there are people out there. But the official free agents, Lamar Jackson, Geno Smith, Daniel Jones, Jimmy G, and Jacoby Brissett, with Carson Wentz making all that money, you have to figure out a way to get out from under that contract if you're going to get one of the bigger names that hit free agency. And also Lamar and Geno Smith probably don't hit free agency if, for long, if there's franchise tags involved or whatever it might be. Do you get into the Derek Carr stuff? That deadline's in 10 days, man. Like, we might have some Derek Carr news during Super Bowl week here.
Well, there was talk that they might cut him before the Pro Bowl because if he injured himself at the Pro Bowl, they'd be on the hook for the money.
Oh, man, that's so much to be. And there's a lot of heavy rumors with the Raiders and Aaron Rodgers. So, I mean, that's the other thing with Washington. They have been the epitome of QB purgatory. Even the year that they drafted Dwayne Haskins, they still took a shot at a first-round quarterback, but it was at number 15, right? It was after, a lot of teams didn't take Dwayne Haskins, right? He was a middle of the first-round type of player.
I liked what they did right up until the Carson Wentz trade. Like, I actually thought they were doing a good job of, you took a swing in the draft, it didn't work out. You do what you do when you have a decent team, but not a quarterback. You bring in Ryan Fitzpatrick. He lasted like 40 snaps, so that didn't happen. Taylor Heineke had shown flashes. He had that game against Tom Brady in the playoffs. He just didn't pan out at all. And then it felt like they panicked and went, okay, quick, go get Carson Wentz. And that was just a disaster. So I like generally quite a lot of what they've done, but then this most recent move, a quarterback, felt completely panicked.
Any predictions as to which way they go? They're going to go with Sam Howell as the guy?
I don't see how you can do that. I really don't. I think they have to find some better viable option than that. They'll cut Carson Wentz.
Anthony Richardson or something in the draft, maybe?
I think they'll go veteran. I don't know that they'll draft one. So, I mean, they make a lot of sense for the sort of Derek Carr thing of, at least he's okay,
Yeah. I mean,
let's shoot for okay. We're worse than that.
Remember a couple years ago we said, like, what if a team just goes, veteran QB by veteran QB all the way through? You get, Marcus Mariota and Phillip Rivers, and the Colts have kind of done that a little bit.
And Washington.
All the Wentz teams, right?
Yeah.
The Colts have done that, and Washington's done that. But because Carson Wentz he wasn't even like a massive failure with the Colts. But because they didn't make the playoff, because in Week 18 he was a massive failure, it felt like a big failure, and this feels like a big failure by Washington. How burnt do these teams feel and feel like they need to draft, I guess, is the question.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like I think Washington, again, because of winning it a bit this year as well, they feel like they just need something that's half decent, right? Wentz wasn't. Heineke wasn't. Sam Howell, sure, but we've seen like a ridiculously small sample size from him. So just plug somebody in here who will be fine. That's it. That's all I want. And that's Derek Carr.